So welcome everybody. My name is Bifan Zawahir from Sri Lanka, and I'm hosting this session with Yana Clemens from South Africa. And we are two of more than 160 members of the Rights-Centric Education Network, which is striving to pull education into alignment with the evolution of human rights. Broadly, that means human rights discourse has been evolving since at least 1948, but education, as you see, it hasn't, and we think that there needs to be an alignment coming in, but we'll get into more details of that as we go along. So Jan and I, like many others before us, and hopefully many more to come, and including some of the people who are here today, wanted and want to fix education, but you can't fix something that's broken unless you know what it is you want it to do. And again, for Jan and I, like many others, but perhaps not as many as the number of people who want to fix education, the mainstream narrative of what education is supposed to do didn't sit very well. So, like when I was in school some 3 or 4 decades ago, I was told to study well and get a good job. And I was wondering, so, what about the people who can't study well? Don't they deserve to get good jobs? And when I asked those kind of questions, I was sort of told to not ask unnecessary questions. And I think fortunately I didn't stop asking questions because, how could somebody else decide what was necessary, what was a necessary question for me, right? But anyway, so the first part of fixing education is deciding what it is for. And because otherwise you end up like Alice in Wonderland, and it doesn't matter which direction you go if you don't know where you're trying to go to. So unfortunately, though, this is a bit of a wicked question because it's wrapped up in so many layers of intrigue and confusion. Many different people, often well-intentioned people, say very different things, and then it can be really hard to make sense of what we want to do. And often when somebody is trying to do something different, there are actually young people in their lives who need them to do something quickly. Like in the case of me and Dilip in Sri Lanka, we didn't want for our son to be part of the mainstream system, and he couldn't wait 10 years for us to figure out what is education for. So we started Kinder Republic 4 years ago, and back then we didn't have the answers we have now about what education is for. And I think a lot of people then end up accepting the same goals of the mainstream system, which is primarily preparation for employment and a little bit of preparation for citizenship, and just tweak with the methods of how we achieve that. But one of the more recent realizations that I had is that although we have a lot of people who are talking about what is education for and what education should be and things like that, they are mostly not asking the question, what is education for me? They are asking the question or answering the question, what is education for other people? So, policymakers are deciding education for millions, if not billions of children, but the children themselves don't have any say in this. So, for me, this is, a bit of a problem. There is this saying, nothing about us without us. If the decisions that are being made don't center on the needs of the people who it's supposed to benefit, then it's probably not going to be a good decision. This doesn't mean that we don't want people to be concerned about others' education, because it's such a big, complex thing that's changing so fast. We do need people to support other people in a variety of ways. But when it comes to the level that they're speaking over the needs of the beneficiaries, not even listening to what these beneficiaries want, then it's going to be a bit of a problem. We had some national level elections in Sri Lanka late last year. And when it turned out that a certain segment of the population had voted for the candidate who didn't win, there were remarks about those people being uneducated, which suggests to me that if they had enough opportunity and resources, they would keep on educating those supposedly uneducated people until they voted for the candidate that they wanted them to vote for. And the idea that you educate the minority until they do what the majority tells them to do is quite a travesty of democracy. So the idea or the thing that this is coming around with elections is quite scary. And for those of us in the global south, this is not really different to how colonizers came to our countries and told us what was good for us because they were superior to us. Right? So there is a lot of problems when people in positions of authority are deciding, or who have more power, are deciding on the education of people with less power. And we are sort of so used to this that for many adults, and actually even probably for many children, the idea that children should have a say in their education is quite alien. But before I proceed, so why should you listen to me and Yana on this, right? We are not some heads of UNICEF or UNESCO or even, attached to some big university with a PhD or something like that, right? So, lots of people have lots of ideas about education. What makes our ideas, different or special? And I think it's really not about who we are, but it's just that the things we are going to be quoting is what is enshrined in international human rights law. So we are quoting things that our nations, all of our nations, leaders present and past, have actually agreed on in international forums as things that should be there for all mankind. So, and it's codified in international human rights law. There are very definitive statements of these things. There is the possibility to report that this country is not upholding this human right, and certain mechanisms to take place. So I think because we have something that is grounded in that is why I hope you would listen to what we have to share with you. And it's not so much about our ideas, but we are just being messengers here, I think. So just to give an example on that, the foundation document for the modern human rights discourse is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was from December 1948, so 76 years old now. And in the preamble, it talks about how disregard for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, freedom from fear and want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So, how can there be freedom of speech and belief if everything about our education, especially young people's education, are being decided by other people without listening to what those people really want, right? And anyway, the UDHR is just the beginning of what it means to consider human rights in education. So I'm gonna Jana's going to take over and go in a bit more detail.
Right. So again, as Stefan pointed out, everything that we're quoting is coming from human rights documents, treaties, agreements that all of us have made. But sometimes we need to think a little bit more about what it is we've agreed to and whether we're actually acting on that. So general comment number 1, addressing Article 29 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child around the aims of education, for example, explains that approaches which do no more than seek to superimpose the aims and values of the article on the existing system without encouraging any deeper changes are clearly inadequate. And this makes it clear that it is not enough to try to paste respect for children's rights on top of an existing education provision. Yet, isn't that exactly what pretty much most of us actually do? For example, maybe we have a public school or a private school or a little cottage school, an alternative education setting, even a home education plan. But all of us put all our attention onto what we're going to make sure that children, and how we're going to check that they've learned it. For example, maybe we're going to make sure they can read and do maths, and we're going to use standardized tests. Or maybe we're going to make sure they learn yoga and organic gardening, and we're going to get them to make lap book portfolios. Maybe we're even going to make sure they learn how to be free, independent, critical thinkers and good community members, or good at emotional self-regulation. And maybe we're not going to assess them at all because they can assess themselves. Whatever our plans are, what we have in common is that we spend lots of time and effort making those plans. And then we get started and we roll out our wonderful plan for their education, as Stefan pointed out. And then there they are in front of us, and we treat them however it is that we're used to treating children. And usually that's either a continuation of how we ourselves were treated as children, or it's an attempt to react against how we were treated when we were young. And really, that's luck of the draw. And even within a single community or a single school, we're going to find some colleagues and co-parents who are going to treat young people with respect, and others won't even realize that they don't. Some might think they're being kindly and protective, while young people are experiencing them as being patronizing and offensive and stifling young people that they think are serving. Others might think they're being firm and fair, while young people actually experience the interaction as abusive and cruel. And some will even openly and deliberately treat young people as inferiors who should defer to and obey their so-called elders and betters. Now, given that all of these adults are still sticking to the planned program, whether it's teaching yoga or maths, etc., and they are officially helping those young people learn what they are meant to learn, there's not a lot you can do about all of that when that is your focus. So this is what happens when we put education first and then try to add respect and fulfillment for young people's rights on top. It doesn't make for a stable balance. What if instead we started by thinking about, instead of thinking about what we want the children to learn or how we will find out how well they've learned it, or even by thinking about all of the wonderful ways we're going to support their learning, what if we started by thinking how we're going to treat them? Now, not everyone actually realizes that human rights is about how we treat each other. It's easy to confuse rights and entitlement and focus on rights as if they are something that each of us has that we can make demands about. But actually, human rights are a guide for how to treat each other well. It's the best way we've figured out to date to spell out the details of the golden rule. Human rights gives us a practical guide on how to treat ourselves and others with respect as full human beings. And they're actually a guide for how to treat each other well, even when we don't understand each other, which is hugely important. When we put rights first and at the center, and then we grow education around that core, we get a very different result from when we try to paste human rights on top of an existing education structure. So all of the other plans that we need to make can often start just falling into place as a direct result of simply putting rights at the center. This is because rights are largely determined and defined by all of the conditions, all of the things we need as human beings for our well-being and our thriving. A person who has all of their human rights respected and fulfilled is a person who's set up to thrive. And on the other hand, when our rights are impacted, and to the extent that they are not fulfilled, it becomes harder to thrive. Now let's add in another link, because part of human thriving is always, by definition, learning and growing. And we know this instinctively. Show us a child who's not growing and not learning, and we will say this child is not thriving. On the other end of the lifespan, show us a senior citizen who spends active time growing their connections, learning new things, and we'll say this person is thriving. In a way that another senior citizen doing nothing but lie in bed, we would say is maybe not. So learning and thriving are deeply interconnected. Looking at the whole of that connection, ensuring that a child's rights are met, sets them up for thriving, which includes automatically setting them up for learning. In other words, using the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child to help us check how we are treating young people and making that the foundation of our education spaces and interactions ensures that children will thrive, which sets them up to learn. And that creates solid roots and foundations for all of our endeavors. And back to Stefan.
Okay, thank you. So I will share a little bit of some examples of some specific rights and what they could look at, like if education centered them, maybe versus what they don't. So nowadays, there's a lot of talk about 21st century education or modern education, or I don't know, all sorts of buzzwords. And the story behind this is that the presently mainstream system of education, which developed in Prussia in the 1700s, was to develop obedient factory workers, and modern workers are different. So we need a different system, and they'll talk about the 4 C's or the 7 C's or social emotional learning or this curriculum or that technology platform. And they might even talk about student choice, but the choice is usually things like, do you want to study maths as a project, or do you want to study maths as a lecture, or when do you want to learn it? The option of perhaps choosing not to study maths until they feel ready to study maths is not a student choice usually. But this doesn't really address the fundamental problem, because when the Prussians developed the presently mainstream system of education, they didn't care about the human rights of the common people. There were no human rights for anybody back then. So even the basic structures and process of education are coercive and violent. And so although there have been a lot of good people over the last decades advocating for a human rights-based approach to education, the core of education, the core practices have really not changed. And we'll see how the UN has also been actually calling for this change, but it hasn't happened. And my suspicion is that it's sort of taken for granted that this education system, because it's the education system that almost everybody in every country is using, is inherently good, and we just have to work on the curriculum and things like that. But we, for example, have to question, where does this notion of curriculum come from? It wasn't always a part of education before the Prussian invention. The idea of professional teachers whose job is to teach, who are disconnected from the practice, is also part of the system. It wasn't always like that when we look at other systems of education. So we need to really get at the core. And when we, of course, there are many human rights treaties that are applicable in education, but for now, as the Rights-Centric Education Network, we are mainly focusing on the UN CRC. One, because it's the most widely ratified UN treaty, except for the US, every other member country has ratified it. It deals with very specific rights for children, and children are the sort of bulk of what is happening in terms of education, and who are the most impacted by the Prussian system and all the coercion in it, because it's considered compulsory, whereas there are problems in higher education, but at least in principle, you could choose not to go without being hauled up into courts and fined and things like that. So anyway, it's not some fluffy kind of philosophical argument. It is human rights law. And if there's anybody here who doesn't know that these treaties are binding commitments on states, then I think we should question why the education that you received didn't include that. Right? If you were a child in school in the 1990s or later, why were you not educated on your rights as a child? Right? Do you know your rights under the ICCPR or the ICSCR? Do you know your fundamental rights under the constitution of your country? If you're working, do you know your labor rights? So because if you don't know what your rights are, you don't know if they are being violated. In Sri Lanka, they are supposedly still talking about how to introduce child rights into the curriculum. We ratified the treaty, I think, in 1991. So 30 something years later, they're still wondering how to do it. Knowing the Sri Lankan system, I quite suspect it will be introduced in a way that if you can't say what Article 19 is at an MCQ test, then you're going to be penalized, but it's not actually going to change how children are treated in schools. They're going to memorize the CRC like they memorize the periodic table, which is also rather sad because Mendel have developed the periodic table so that people wouldn't have to memorize it. But okay, getting into some specific examples. Article 12 is the right to be heard, and I think of this as the gateway right that really opens up to everything else. So children's rights has the same freedom of expression article that adults have, and that means you can hold and express opinions. But just because you have the freedom to express yourself, it doesn't mean anybody actually has to listen to you. But because the authors of the CRC recognize that children are usually not listened to, they made it very explicit that children have a right to be heard. So it's not just that you can dismiss what they say as random ramblings of people who don't know what they're talking about. But you do need to take into account what they say. You need to make it easy for them to say things because, of course, if you keep telling them, like what happened to me as a child, not to ask unnecessary questions, then many of them are going to stop asking questions. So how do you actually support children to exercise their right is something that's very important in this system. And just to take some more examples on this, so critical thinking is one of the buzzwords these days, and every educator is saying that's crucial. But if a child were to exercise critical thinking to ask, how is it that adults get to make all the important decisions about education? Then the educators will say, like, no, not like that, right? And basically, there is no opportunity to exercise the right to be heard. Recently, 2 years ago, there was a global campaign survey kind of thing to actually ask young people. I think this was 14 upwards, if I remember right. So there was about upwards of 400,000 young people from around the world who participated in preparing this declaration, and they were asked, what do you expect from education? So, all the right to be heard was there from 1989. This was the first time that there had been a large-scale international effort to actually ask them, what do you want? And a lot of times, policymakers will talk about teacher training being as the most important thing to have, and the youth also recognize this, but it's somewhere like in the bottom third of their demands, and even then, they are also talking about the rights of teachers as well. So it's not just that they want teacher training. And what is at the top is actually that they want a voice at the table, they want to be heard, they want to take part in decisions on their education. So this is exactly the right to be heard. So they are asserting, even though they're not maybe referring to it explicitly, but they're asserting we want to be heard in decisions about education. This is the number one thing. And teacher training is there, but it's in like the bottom third. So if anybody is serious about education that centers the needs and the very explicitly expressed needs of young people, then they should be focusing on the right to be heard, and teacher training can come a bit later. And this one, the point 8 in the declaration, is very much aligned with the idea of right-centric education, that when education is centered on the human rights of all participants, then we can have peace and human rights that enables motivated, enjoyable quality of life. So just to also say, as far as right-centric education is concerned, it's the human rights of everybody involved. So the students, the teachers, the officials, anybody involved in it. But right now, in terms of our activities, we are more focused on child rights. Then the next one I wanted to share about is Article 15, freedom of association and peaceful assembly. And quite interestingly, there is a very specific condition laid out under which this can be restricted. Right? So freedom of association can be restricted if it's necessary for national security or public safety or public order. So if it's some massive violent march, then, well, that's not peaceful assembly anyway, so it's not on. But if you look at how schools are organized, and children have very limited opportunities to interact with children other than of their own age and out of their school, and sometimes very limited out of their classroom. Even the adults who they associate with are not in their control. They don't have the freedom to not associate with certain children or adults if they don't wish to. And none of those restrictions are there for the reasons stipulated in the convention. They are there because, well, they were there when the current policymakers were in school. And it was there because the then policymakers had those in school when they were. Then it goes all the way back to 1700. So we've been just doing the same thing the same way because, well, it's really convenient for the adults to do it this way because then they are very much in control. But being in control of things is not the same thing as centering human rights. So let's take one more example. Right. So freedom of expression. The title here is a little bit misleading because it sounds like freedom of speech, right? You know, you can express something. But if you look at the actual text of it, it's the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. Because what's the point in being free to express yourself if you aren't also free to receive information, if you can't seek information? Right? If you're only expressing the things that you've been sort of brainwashed into, this right is meaningless. So you have to be able to go out and seek, question, ask. And this has to be regardless of frontiers. So you can't be having like censorship kind of things in it. Or what is happening in the mainstream system, there is a very explicitly defined curriculum, and that is the be all and end all of what they can receive. So if you, I don't know, if a child in Sri Lanka were to say that I want to learn about the history of apartheid in South Africa, the child would be told like not to bother with that because it's not going to come for your exam, it's not going to be helpful. Don't waste your time doing that. But I would imagine that learning about the history of apartheid would could be beneficial for people in Sri Lanka because there are certain parallels to our life experience here. So the notion of a predetermined curriculum made by policymakers and set in stone for 7 or 8 years at a time is not compatible. This doesn't mean that there should be no curation of content, that it should be some sort of free for all where anybody can do anything. That's not going to be practical. It's going to be quite overwhelming, but there are ways that we can curate things, make them, package them in certain ways to make them accessible, especially for in different forms without actually making it compulsory and without saying don't ask unnecessary questions or don't bother because it's not coming in the exam. So Yana is going to take over and show some examples of like how this actually works. Anna?
So Olivia's also been posting some really nice inspirations to check out in the chat and some great places to explore. And I'm also going to be just picking up on that theme of, it's not that nobody's done anything. it actually sort of has been reality checked that it's completely possible to thoroughly center children's rights in education spaces and their educational interactions to very significant levels. It has been done, it is being done, and there's multiple decades of experience to show that the impact on learning is very good. Though even before children's rights were defined as such, a number of education initiatives were founded around the idea of treating children differently and letting other aspects of educational provision naturally emerge from that respectful treatment that lay at the foundational core. A few initiatives that come to mind are firstly, the Dom Zero orphanage founded in Poland around 1912. Another is Summer Hill School in the UK, founded in the early 1920s. Sudbury Valley School, founded in the late 1960s in the USA. Hadera Democratic School, founded in Israel in the late 1980s. And Nuestra Escuela, founded in Puerto Rico around the year 2000. Now, just coming back to the fact that this approach truly does create solid foundations, let's notice that only Dom Zero is not still open today, and that's due to everyone involved being murdered during World War II. All of these other spaces deliberately built around a different way to treat children are still going strong after more than 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, and 100 years, respectively. But when I started my own journey of exploration in this direction in 2005, searching for a form of education that would fulfill all rights for all children, I didn't know about a single one of these. And most people still don't. And most people, even in human rights community spaces, don't. And now my own community, Riverstone Village, founded in 2017, and Sifan's Kinder Republic, founded in 2021, are two of literally hundreds of education spaces all around the globe that put young people's rights at the center. And I'm constantly discovering more. And there are constantly more being founded. So numbers for most countries are hard to come by as a result of the difficulty in categorizing human scale education initiatives accurately. But the National Microschooling Center in the USA estimates that in the United States alone, there were over 95,000 microschools and learning pods serving more than 1 million students in 2023. Now, of course, not all of these will be centering children's rights. We need to be very clear on that. Many will be making the same old mistake of starting with the right to education without considering how their offerings will ensure that the full range of other rights will also be fulfilled within that setting and interaction. But still, many education innovators and founders are passionate about both education and rights and are aiming to respect and protect the children in their care. But currently, we're all siloed, partly because education is so complex that it's hard to find common ground. And I think this is what's so exciting about an event like the Learning Planet, is it gives so many of us a chance to find out about each other and interconnect and also come together around common ground. So what Sifan and I are also proposing, over all of our differences, all of our varieties, all of our countries and our backgrounds, is that the rights-centric education concept is a very simple compass that can help us align our work, and it can cut across our differences and really emphasize what it is that we have in common, because there doesn't need to be a barrier between publicly funded versus privately funded versus various different styles of pedagogy between school and home. And very importantly, there doesn't need to be competition between us all, because there's room for us all to collaborate and support each other in taking the next step and the next step and then the next, to ensure that education is set up, if it's being founded, or overhauled, if it's already there, to the point that it supports all rights for all children. So the Rights-Centric Education Network doesn't aim to become another organization as such. Instead, the idea behind it is that it's a rapidly growing community united behind a vision that isn't just about establishing a big social media presence, loudly talking the talk, but the idea is that we need to concretely support each other as we take whatever steps are next for us specifically, as we all join hands to walk the walk together. So the RCE network is all about starting from wherever you are at and whatever level of rights fulfillment your community can stretch to at its growing edge, but then all moving forward together. Now, those of us lucky enough to have a head start have got many resources to share with those who are just getting started. And I'd like to encourage everyone to stay for the back-to-back session that's coming right after this one, because I'll be giving you a bit more of a glimpse into that and a little bit more sort of a day in the life picture. But what we really want is that those who are facing difficult circumstances can meet up and join forces to help each other figure out creative solutions that might be impossible to tackle alone. And those of you who are lucky enough to have the chance to start with a blank page can actually use the RCE compass as a guide from the very beginning, creating deep and strong foundations for everything that you build, with sort of mentorship and support from those who are more experienced. And maybe lots of us will still be going strong in 100 years as a result, and maybe our planet will still be habitable in 100 years, also at least partly, at least largely as a result. So the right to education itself has historically been prioritized because it is an empowerment right that opens the way to the enjoyment of so many other rights. A good education is a gateway to a good life. But too often, education is actually not effective at empowering children, simply because when one right is treated as if it actually outweighs all the others, even that right can be compromised by that focus in the end. If we think how many children have been punished, pressured, imposed upon, or made to feel as if the particular shape of their personal curiosity is a problem instead of an advantage, how many of them have actually learned through education to hate learning? On the other hand, even for those of us aiming to support lifelong learning and thriving, we all still need to start from somewhere, and that means we need to take one thing at a time. Each and every learning community is going to have different priorities and a unique progression of rights to focus on due to their different participants and their larger contexts, such as cultural norms and laws of the land, and also because the young people who are there in those spaces actually need to be the ones who are quality controlling and driving and steering the process, which means that every single journey is going to be unique. So as Stefan was saying earlier, the simplest and most effective way from our perspective to achieve this shift of where we all want to go is to start with the right of the child to be heard and taken seriously. As the rights holders, they are actually the best placed to creatively figure out with our support what it is they actually need in order for all of their rights to be fulfilled. They're the best placed to feel out which rights are the most urgent to address in their circumstances. Once we begin making changes or putting measures in place, they are also the best able to assess how well their needs are now being met by the changes that have been made. So a perfect first step is to make sure they have a real voice, even or especially during the founding phase, but at whatever point your own setting or interaction is beginning. In the end, the most important driver of human rights overall is the fact that ultimately the us, them, in-group, out-group, social, political, and economic divides, and even age-based and generational divides are all just like fingers and toes on one unified human body. There's no individual liberation without liberation for all. And as we can support each other in shifting and accept each other's support in our own shifting, so do we all shift bit by bit towards the thriving that we know in our hearts must be possible for everyone and for the whole and for the planet. So Stefan is going to tell you a little bit about the concrete nuts and bolts of the RCE network and how you can join and get involved, and we can do this together.
Yeah, thanks, Yana. So we drafted late last year the Declaration of Child Rights-Centric Education. We launched it on the anniversary of the convention on November 20th. So currently there are over 300 individuals, adults and children, and organizations who have signed this declaration. So there is quite a bit of a preamble and a justification in the document, but the simplest matter is that we are declaring that we should take progressive measures to fundamentally rework all practices of education to ensure they're consistent with human rights values and principles, which is something taken directly from the human rights discourse. These are part of general comments or agreements at the United Nations General Assembly that there has been recognition that the practices of education are not consistent with human rights and they need to be changed. And this has been said in different forms since 1948. It's been said quite loudly since 1989, but I don't know, maybe because people tend to treat rights as something sort of fluffy and out there and not for us, it's largely been ignored. But there is a very, well, we hope we made a very solid case of why this change should be. It doesn't mean that the change is going to happen overnight. Any environment, whether it's home or school or anything, can look at the CRC, think deeply, what does this mean? Ask the children, what does it mean? Or how do they see this being implemented? And then while keeping the system running, because you can't just, suddenly say we're changing over to all these rights at once, it will be kind of chaotic. But while we keep the system running, how do we progressively make the changes to bring the rights in, and different environments can be supporting each other, because it's not a competition. When one place has better human rights, it supports everybody having better human rights. So if you go to this link, rights-centric.education/declaration, there will be a fairly wordy kind of document, because formal declarations are written formally, but there is a simplified version. But ultimately, it's for signing the declaration, what you need to think is, if there is a practice of education that violates human rights, should we uphold the practice or should we uphold human rights? Like in Sri Lanka, still corporal punishment in school is legal and accepted. There is some paperwork in process to change that, but even when the law changes, it will take a while for social attitudes to change. But for me, that's a very clear-cut case. There is an article in the CRC that children have a right to be safe from violence, and this should also, this is not just street violence or war, but this is also violence that takes place in school. So it's just very simply clear that it violates the rights, and we should change how we do things. And then it's not only about the right to be free from violence, but all the rights. We can't cherry pick the convenient rights and say only these are important and we are going to ignore the rest. We have to work on them all. But it's reasonable to have priorities, to discuss with the stakeholders, especially the children, and agree, okay, we are going to, first we're going to do the right to be heard. We want to really hear what you want done. And then let's see what we can do in the next 3 months and the next 3 months. So we can do that. But the starting point is the declaration to build momentum for this idea that we should center child rights in education. And if you sign, then please talk about it, share about it on social media. If you can get it in the press, do so. If you have newsletters, do so. So this will encourage more and more people to sign. And signing the declaration is really just saying, I think this is a good idea, that I would like to make it happen. It doesn't actually oblige you to take any more action. But for those who would, and we hope there will be people who would, then you are also welcome to join the network. So it's completely free to join. You just have to give us some information so we know who you are. And you can take whatever is happening anywhere else in the network and make use of it. There is really everything to gain and nothing to lose. And the key thing that we are hoping to launch sometime in the course of this year is what we call the Rights-Centric Education Framework. And this is just our name for something that was approved by the UN General Assembly, I think in 2005, which was, they said we should have a rights-based quality assurance system for schools that would report on how well each school is upholding rights. And although it was approved, no country actually did it because, well, when it comes to a lot of rights related things, unless the people pressure the state, then the state just doesn't do it. So we need to pressure them. But at the same time, we are not going to wait for them to do this framework. We can do it as a civil society movement. The idea is that each environment, it could be a school, it could be a homeschooling cooperative, it could be a homeschooling family, world schooling, whatever it is, reports periodically on what are the actions they're taking to uphold child rights in the environment. So previously, the freedom of expression was limited in these areas, and now we are removing these rules so that that right is no longer violated. And then the next day they talk about something else and something else, and it keeps going on. And actually, this is the exact same process that countries do for the rights treaties. Every 4 or 5 years, they have to say these are the things we did since the last review, and they're questioned by it from the community, and they can be given recommendations. In our case, we wouldn't be questioning from an accountability sense because this is all voluntary to participate, but there could be people who could say things like, hey, I see you're struggling with this kind of thing. We had this issue 2 years ago. Would you like us to share how we handled it? So there is support that could be forthcoming, but no judgment. Because it's, if I make a report saying at Kinder Republic we respect children's rights in A, B, C, D ways, and if our families look at this and say, no, Sifan, you're not doing any of these things, why are you lying? And so that's our accountability, right? If you're not reporting the truth, then those families will leave, right? And a network distributed over multiple countries can't give that accountability, but it can give me the support where I say, no, young people are saying this right is not being upheld and I don't know what to do, and other people can support me on this. So we hope you will not only join the declaration, sign the declaration, but also join the network. So I believe that's the last slide we had. We have about 7 minutes if anybody would like to ask some questions. Yes, Julie.
Hi, thank you for hosting this event. I'm just curious. I put the question in the chat. I'm thinking a great way to get the word out about this is that when people sign, just like when you register for an event, there's an option to share, and then it automatically posts and says, I signed this, and and it's a way to auto-generate it. Is that in place right now?
Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of thing. We were sort of thinking about hosting on a petition site like change.org, which does that kind of thing, but it felt a bit awkward to because it's not really a petition, right? This is not something that's being sent to anybody. And then we also wanted to be able to separately capture whether this is a child who is exercising their rights, whether it's an organization, so that we can display that. So unfortunately, going into that meant that we didn't really have the easy share options available.
I think it's a great idea, though, if there's a way to do both and.
I think some people don't know that a Declaration of Child Rights even exists. So, I guess that's where I'm seeing it. If someone says, I just signed the Declaration of Child Rights, and someone could look at the post and say, wow, what is that? And then they click and have a look.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even many countries have signed it. I don't think that all countries. I think most of them did.
Yeah, that would be the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think it's everybody but the USA. But also, in terms of the right-centric education, the Child Right-Centric Education Declaration, we need to get the word out for both, really. So given the time is quite short, I also just want to encourage people, if you haven't looked through the chat, there's so many beautiful resources that have been shared in the chat. And I think we'll also find a way to share that chat recording when we share the recording of the session. Has anybody got a last question before we go on to sort of part 2, which is sort of a back-to-back session, looking more at the day-to-day, how it can look when young people's rights are thoroughly centered?
Just to quickly add that eventually this recording will be posted on the Rights-Centric Education website. But if you sign the declaration or join the network, you will automatically be added to our mailing list to receive things. But if you just like to follow up on this session without being added to that, then just send me either put on the group chat or send me as a private message or email address, and I'll just follow up with you on the recording only.
So Tasha is also saying she'd find it really helpful if there was a list of ways and examples that compulsory schooling breaks human rights, like the examples that you were giving. And I think that, again, we kind of need to get to the point where we start getting some funding, because at the moment we're 100% just volunteers. But we actually started experimenting a couple of months ago with even some input from some of the young people in our networks on developing an AI interface that would help people. You would input your question, and then it would actually link it to, various human rights documents and help you figure out, where you stand in terms of whether something is actually rights aligned or not. And then we would be able to sort of add then the human input in terms of our experience of how to get there. Yeah, okay, so Sifan has posted a link to some examples there. The AI is really, getting to the point that, a lot of the publicly available AIs can already do that if you phrase your questions well. We still have 2 minutes before the start of the next section. Right. Okay. So you're saying World System Solutions is developing a Phoenix platform for this purpose. That's great news. Do you want to, is it too soon to have a link for that in the chat? Or how do we sign up to be kept posted? Richard, you can, after Julie. Julie?
It is too soon. We've got it spec'd. We're developing it. We're in a fundraising portion. We're hoping to have a prototype released soon. Our goal is to support the unification and empowerment of every soul on the planet, and the synchronization of efforts to generate a healthier and equitable future.
Great. All right, we're going to hand it over to Richard to say a couple of words before we head into the back-to-back session.
Some people have already heard enough from me today, but I'll add a little more now. There's the Two Loops model video, which I find really useful because it kind of pinpoints where we're at today and what we need to do. And my focus with it is the idea of communities of practice. That's when all these diverse groups working on towards the same goal finally start coming together and exercising their collective voice. And that becomes the community of practice. The point at which, and this is the key, the point at which resources start flowing from the old regime to the new. But we do have to do fundraising in that to keep our current programs going. But we really need to be targeting all of this money that's pouring into the old system and start claiming our share of that. And we can't do it unless we start to become that community of practice, collectively exercising our voices.
Right. Thank you, everybody. This is the end of session 1, and we'll now be going into second session, which is going to look at what does it look like on the ground, day to day, within a community where treating young people differently is the starting point around which education then develops.